Alright, this is a classic game. It's a center game. Winawer versus Steinitz. Steinitz being a world champion. This is the center game. Black center pawn's eliminated, but white loses some time with his queen. This is the main line, even today. It was played a very long time ago. So, white castles queen side, black king side. Opposite side castling means you could pawn storm your opponent, as well as use pieces against his king. Both sides can do that. With rook e8 is the main line still today. Black has ideas of playing d5, taking advantage of the pin against the e-pawn. Rook pins the e-pawn to the queen, and it's just better on e8 than it was before. So one of the main ideas today is queen g3, but bishop c4 is logical. It discourages d5. So Steinitz takes the pawn, which is the other idea of rook e8, taking the e-pawn when you can. Now you can't take with the rook, because in that case you eliminate the knight, and then if he takes your bishop, you take the rook. If he takes your queen, you take his queen. So white would win a piece there by elimination. Takes the pawn with his knight, and he wants to take the bishop on c3, discover attack on the queen. So white plays queen f4. The idea is queen f7, check, or bishop f7, check. The main idea being queen f7, queen g7, mate. So black controls f7, puts knight back. White develops d6. Okay, this is pretty much the end of the opening. Black has an extra pawn, but he hasn't quite finished his development. What does white have for his pawn sacrificed? He has open lines for his bishops. They're very strong attacking, putting pressure on the enemy king side. Also, his rooks are connected. He's a little bit ahead in development. Steinitz likes these positions for black, because black's pawn structure is very solid. He has no weaknesses. If he plays correctly, then he should be a pawn up, but he has to endure the white attack. So white starts a threat on f7. Black brings down his bishop. Which is a normal defensive strategy. Just want to trade off attackers, and he completes the development of his minor pieces. Winning piece trades, and someday maybe capture an f7. So this is a typical sacrifice. Knight goes to g5. When the h6 pawn comes up, white plays h4, leaves the knight as a passive sacrifice. If black takes, white gets open file for his rook. In fact, white would be winning here if the knight moves. Say knight d5. Then this nice sacrifice draws the king to the h file, and the queen penetrates, but not yet. First bishop g7, because if the queen penetrates right away, the king runs to e7, which is typical. The king's able to run to the center and escape the h file pressure. Meanwhile, black has an extra rook and minor piece, so he'd be winning if he escaped. So this move is great. When he takes on g7, he keeps the king from escaping and threatens queen h8 mate. The king captures, queen h6, controlling f8, the king has to go to g8. And now rook h1 and queen h8 is unstoppable. Black has to control h8, or he has to block the h file. He can't do either one of those ideas. And the idea is to open up f7 so the king can run f7. So if he tries a move like f5, now the queen check still works though in this case, because he goes to f7, rook check, king goes up, queen g7 mates him. So queen and rook still mate him, even though he goes to f7, he doesn't escape very far. So it looks like black can't take. So this is an interesting sacrifice, but it's a standard sacrifice nowadays. Computers suggest the best defense for black here is knight e5. This is very logical. The knight on c6 does not guard the black king, so it goes to e5 to shield off the bishop. In this line, white wins back his pawn, and he may have a discovery on the queen. But first it's black to move. Now he shields off his queen, discovers on the white queen. Then he moves the queen off the line. Now black's a little bit better here because his pieces are centralized. However, he gave back his pawn, and Steinitz does not like to give back pawns, especially he has no real weaknesses. So knight d5, he wants to trade the queen or the bishop. Of course, it's going to be the bishop with the knight. So white avoids it in a clever manner. Bishop h7 check. Black has two choices. but really only h8 is his move. h8 looks really risky because the bishop lines up with the king, as well as the rook on h1. There's potential discoveries and pins against the king there. f8's worse though. The knight's held by the bishop, so you can take the bishop off. You cannot take with the pawn because he's pinned. Takes the rook, knight, take the knight off. White's got an extra bishop, actually 2 bishops for a knight, so, and pawn, so white's just winning here. Therefore king goes to h8. Now that's another typical sacrifice. Sometimes they call it Russian exchange sacrifice. It became a popular term in the 1950s. This was way before then, so it was a rare idea at that time. Rook takes d5. The idea is you trade your rook for a minor piece. Your remaining minor piece is very strong because it has no equal. You have 2 rooks though, so sacrificing 1 rook, you still have the other one to use for attacking along files or ranks. So he takes on d5, limits the knight, limits the threat to his queen and bishop. Black takes back. White remains with extra dark squared bishop for rook and pawn, but the rook on a8 does not help black, and neither does the d6 pawn very much. No, this bishop is very strong, lining up with the king. So one idea, if black did nothing in particular after bishop e4, one idea is to use a pin against his pawn. So if black, say, did a nothing move, like rook b8, you could play knight f7, forking king and queen. Also opens up the line for the queen on f4 to go to h6. So the line opening sacrifice. It's exploit of the pin of the bishop against the pawn and king. So he's exploiting the pin on the g-pawn. King moves over, queen in a face mate. So this would be a good variation for white. His main idea here. His second idea is just to take the bishop on d5. So if black ignores that, protects f7, again, you would just take the bishop. Now white would have 2 bishops versus rook and pawn. 2 bishops are usually equal to about 7 pawns. Rook and pawn are only 6 pawns. So white would have a clear advantage here. Plus he's still attacking. All his pieces are aimed towards the enemy king. Both bishops, the knight, the queen, the rook. And he has the pawn available also. So black's losing at that point. Now later on they came up with an improvement. Rook takes the bishop on e4. Also an exchange sacrifice, counter exchange sacrifice. Eliminates one of the attackers. So one defensive strategy is to give back the material that you have. Steinitz didn't have that strategy though. It became popular in the early 20th century, and Steinitz was still in 19th. So after it takes on e4, the knight takes it. You could play a knight e5 and block out this bishop. Now black's kind of a pawn up, so white could win back his pawn, but black's fine here. It's about an equal game, but Steinitz probably thought he was much better. Another try for white is knight f7, forking king and queen, but the white queen's attacked. So the idea of this is, if he takes the knight, then the queen h6 pattern's on, followed by queen g7 mate. But black could break the pattern. King g8. Notice there's no more white squared bishop to attack him on white squares. And if you take his queen, he would take the white queen. Meanwhile, black's still a rook up. White has a queen knight hanging, so black's just totally winning here. Alright, Steinitz thought this works. f6. So reduces the power of the bishop on c3. Strengthens e5. White takes on d5. Now white has 2 bishops for rook and pawn. Clearly this is better for white, because the 2 bishops are much stronger than rook and pawn. He still has the attack with all his pieces, 5 pieces and a pawn, pointing to the enemy king. He's threatening knight f7. So Steinitz eliminated the knight. He could try to play knight e5. This blocks out the bishop. This is probably the most logical try, if you realize taking the knight gets mated. So queen wants to go to h7. Blocks out the queen. Queen goes to f4. So now white's idea is maybe knight e6, or taking the knight f7. Black still cannot take the knight. he's threatening. When he takes out the knight, the point of the sacrifice, not just to open h file, but his pawn is very useful. Controlling the f6 square and h6 square. So he plays h5 to keep, block out the rook. He can still sacrifice. Let's freeze the pawn to go to g6. Now he's threatening queen h6 mate. This is the exploit. Knight cannot take, it's pinned. Now if queen h7, the king goes forward. So this is a nice check. It forces the queen to block. Now the king cannot move to g5, so queen h7. That was obstruction. Forced him to obstruct his own queen with a bishop check. So now the king was g7, but the knight fork forced him to give up his rook. So now white has two bishops versus knight and pawn. Totally easy win for white. Plus, black king side still very weak. All right. Takes the knight. Now taking the knight eliminates an attacker, but the bishop extends its power. So when white captures back on g5, his threat is rook h6 mate. Pawn cannot take, it's pinned. This knight blocks out the bishop. Okay. g6. So now the pawn advances, and it acts like a piece. The line g5 controlled h7, and also controlled f7. So the pawn does the same function. It also blocks the g pawn from moving. White's threat is rook h6, and when black captures back, queen h6. He actually cannot stop that at all. You just take here right away. Checkmate. Queen f6. Could just execute the threat. It's mate. Queen g5 doesn't work. The h pawn's pinned, so you just take it. So, no matter what black does, he's going to be checkmated next move. Notice how white's still got 5 attacking units against the enemy king. Black has only 2 defenders. White's attack is just too strong in this game. Classic game. Probably got a brilliancy prize.